1970 Mexico. A World Cup England didn't even win, and it still produced the most replayed defensive moment in football history. Brazil are flying. Jairzinho is bearing down on goal. And out of nowhere, a tall, upright Englishman in white times a tackle so perfectly, so calmly, that commentators are still calling it art 50 years later. That's Bobby Moore. Captain. Gentleman. The man who swapped shirts with Pelé afterward like they just finished a friendly kickabout instead of a World Cup group match. That image, calm, composed, above the chaos, is the version of Bobby Moore that got carved into English football folklore. Captain of the only England side to ever lift the World Cup. The player Pelé himself called the best defender he ever faced. A statue outside Wembley. Stands named after him. Documentaries that treat him like a saint in shin pads. But here's the thing about saints. They're usually built after the fact, out of the parts people want remembered. Because underneath that composed exterior was a man boxed in, undercut, and quietly discarded by the same institutions that now put his face on murals. 5 relationships. 5 sources of real, sustained pressure. Not headline-grabbing feuds with punches thrown. Moore wasn't built like that. This is subtler, colder. The kind of conflict that plays out over years in contract meetings and dropped phone calls and jobs that never materialize. 5 names. 1 order. Let's go through them one at a time exactly as they happened. Before we get into the names themselves, it's worth asking why this story even needs telling. Bobby Moore has been dead since 1993, and in the decades since, his image has only calcified further into something untouchable. A statue, a stand name, a highlight reel that gets dusted off every 4 years like clockwork. But the further a legacy gets from the actual lived experience of the person behind it, the easier it becomes to flatten the complicated parts. Nobody puts the transfer disputes on a plaque. Nobody names a stand after a snubbed coaching application. This video exists to put those parts back in. Ron Greenwood took over West Ham in 1961 and inherited a raw, promising 18-year-old wing half with decent enough feet but no real positional discipline. Greenwood is the one who rebuilt Moore from the ground up, drilled him in reading the game 2-3 passes ahead, turned him from a runner into a reader. Without Greenwood, there's a real argument that 1966 never happens the way it did. So this isn't a story about a bad manager and a resentful player. It's more complicated and more human than that. It's about what happens when a mentor's usefulness has a shelf life, and the player realizes it before the manager does. By the mid-1960s, Moore is the England captain, a World Cup winner, one of the most recognizable athletes in the country. And he's still playing under a contract system that, frankly, treated professional footballers like company property. This was the retain and transfer system, and if you don't know how brutal it actually was, sit with this for a second. Clubs could simply refuse to let a player leave, even after his contract expired, unless they got the fee they wanted. No fee, no move, no say. You were tied to a club the way a tenant is tied to a landlord who's also, conveniently, the only landlord in town. Moore wanted more. Not more money, necessarily, more ambition. Reports from the era link him to interest from Tottenham. A move that could have meant more European football, a bigger stage, a fresh start. West Ham said no. Not maybe. Not let's talk. No. And here's where you start to see the crack in the gentleman captain image. Because Moore didn't take that quietly forever. Tension with Greenwood built through the back half of the 60s. Not shouting matches, nothing that made back-page headlines at the time, but a slow erosion of trust between a manager who saw Moore as his prize creation and a captain who felt like a prisoner of a system designed to keep him small. Let me be fair for a second, because this wasn't purely West Ham being villains. Greenwood built a football philosophy around technical, possession-based play years before it was fashionable in England, and Moore was the living proof of concept. Losing him would have gutted the identity of the club Greenwood had spent a decade constructing. From where Greenwood was standing, holding on to Moore wasn't betrayal, it was survival. But knowing why someone does something doesn't erase the cost to the person on the other end of it. Then came the moment that actually cracked things open for good. Not a transfer saga, but a night out. Before an FA Cup tie in the early 70s, Moore and a few teammates were reported to have been out late, drinking, in a way that didn't sit well with the club's expectations of its captain. It wasn't a scandal on the scale people love to imagine in hindsight, No arrests, no front-page tabloid meltdown, but it was enough. Enough to shift the temperature between player and manager permanently. By 1974, the outcome was almost inevitable. West Ham sold Bobby Moore, a World Cup-winning captain, a club legend, a man who'd given them over a decade of his career, to Fulham, for a fee that, by most assessments, badly undervalued what he'd actually given the club. 13 years, 1 World Cup, hundreds of appearances, and in the end, a transfer that looked less like a fair valuation and more like a club quietly relieved to move on from a relationship that had gone stale. Was it hatred? No. It was a mentor and a protege who outgrew each other, trapped inside a system that gave neither of them a graceful way out. And Greenwood is just name one on this list. Think about the optics of that exit for a second. This is a man whose face was, at the time, arguably the most recognizable in English sport. A man whose leadership at Wembley in 1966 is still replayed every single World Cup summer. And his own club, the club that raised him from teenager to national icon, let him go the way you'd offload a squad player nobody quite needed anymore. No farewell tour befitting what he'd actually given them. Just a fee, a handshake, and a quiet exit through a door that should have opened onto something far grander. Alf Ramsey is not a warm man. Ask anyone who played under him. He didn't do hugs, he didn't do sentiment, he barely did small talk. What he did was win. And in 1966, the currency that mattered most to Ramsey wasn't affection, it was trust on the pitch. Bobby Moore had more of that currency banked with Ramsey than almost any player in England. Here's the piece a lot of retrospectives conveniently skip. Ramsey had doubts about Moore. Real ones. Moore was never the fastest defender in the world. His entire game was built on reading danger a full second before it arrived, positioning himself so perfectly that he rarely needed to sprint at all. Beautiful when it worked. A serious gamble against the quickest attacking sides on the planet. In the build-up to the 1966 World Cup, there were whispers, some public, some behind closed doors, questioning whether Moore's lack of pace would get exposed on the biggest stage of all. Ramsey heard those whispers, and Ramsey kept him anyway, captain, first name on the team sheet, because Ramsey's football brain told him something the critics couldn't see on a stopwatch. Intelligence beats speed when it's calibrated correctly, and Moore's football intelligence was the best Ramsey had ever worked with. That's not friendship. That's a manager making the coldest, most calculated bet of his career, and it paid off with a World Cup. But trust like that has conditions, and Ramsey's conditions were rigid. Discipline, professionalism, controlled public image, the exact things that started slipping in that Greenwood-era drinking incident we just walked through. Because here's the connective tissue between these two relationships. The same night out that damaged Moore's standing at West Ham also reached Ramsey's desk. And Ramsey, despite everything Moore had won for him, despite the armband, despite the captaincy that defined Ramsey's own legacy as a manager, dropped him. Not permanently, not dramatically, but undeniably. A message sent from the top of English football. Even you, Bobby, are not bigger than the standard. Think about what that actually means for a second. This is the most decorated, most trusted, most tactically valuable defender Ramsey has ever had access to, and Ramsey still pulled the trigger the moment his standards were tested. That's not hatred either. It's something colder in a lot of ways. Transactional respect. Moore was trusted exactly as far as he was useful and compliant, and not 1 inch further. There's a strange symmetry to this that's easy to miss. Ramsey built his entire managerial identity around discipline and control. A manager who famously refused to bend to the press, the FA hierarchy, or even the players he needed most. Moore, by contrast, built his identity around composure and control on the pitch. Two men who valued the same trait in different arenas, and who still couldn't fully extend that respect to each other once one of them slipped, even briefly, outside the lines. It says something about how conditional even the strongest professional partnerships in football really are. When Moore's playing career wound down in the mid to late 70s, he did what most legendary captains do. He looked toward the next chapter. Coaching, management, some kind of formal role that let him stay inside the game that had defined him, using the football brain that Ramsey himself had once bet a World Cup on. The FA's response was, functionally, silence. Compare that to how other World Cup winning captains were treated by their own federations. Franz Beckenbauer went from West Germany's on-field leader to managing the national team himself, eventually lifting the World Cup again as a manager. One of the only people in history to captain and manage a World Cup winner. Pelé became a global ambassador for the game, wrapped in ceremonial reverence by Brazilian football for the rest of his life. Bobby Moore, captain of the only England team to ever win the World Cup, got no equivalent path. No fast-tracked coaching role. No ambassador position. No seat at the table. He ended up taking manager jobs at smaller clubs, spells that never came close to matching his stature in the game, and eventually drifted into radio and media work just to stay connected to football at all. Let me be fair for a second, because this wasn't some coordinated conspiracy against one man. English football's coaching pathways in that era were notoriously narrow, old boys network stuff, often rewarding connections and timing over actual football pedigree. Moore wasn't uniquely targeted. He was, in a lot of ways, a symptom of a federation that simply didn't know how to honor its own history. But knowing it's systemic doesn't make it sting less. If anything, it makes it worse. Because it means the man who delivered the FA their single greatest achievement in history wasn't even considered special enough to break the pattern. There's also a quieter, sadder layer to this part of the story. Moore didn't disappear from football entirely. He kept working, kept showing up, took roles abroad, and eventually built a respected career in the media, offering sharp, informed analysis on the game he clearly still loved. But there's a difference between staying connected to the sport out of necessity and being actively cultivated by your own federation as one of its guiding voices. Moore got the former. He arguably deserved the latter. Two of the most powerful relationships in Bobby Moore's footballing life, his national team manager and his national federation, treated him with exactly the same formula. Use him fully while he's useful, offer him nothing once he isn't. And if you think that's as cold as the story gets, wait until we get to the TV pundit who turned Moore's decline into a spectacle. It's worth pointing out how strange that formula looks when you set it against how England, as a nation, talks about 1966 every single time a major tournament comes around. The footage gets dusted off. The commentators reach for the same lines about glory and legacy. Moore lifting the Jules Rimet trophy, wiping his hands on the velvet cloth before shaking the Queen's hand, gets replayed as sacred national iconography. But the institution behind that iconography never matched the reverence with an actual opportunity. It's easy to mythologize a moment from 50 years ago. It's a lot harder, apparently, to hand the man at the center of it a real job. By the early 1970s, Bobby Moore isn't the 25-year-old who read the game a step ahead of Jorginho anymore. He's into his 30s. And in football, 30-something for a defender who built his entire career on positioning rather than raw pace is a dangerous number, because the margin for error that positioning bought him starts shrinking fast. Enter Brian Clough, not as a rival manager, as something arguably more dangerous for Moore's reputation, a television critic with a national platform and zero interest in being gentle about it. Clough had opinions on everyone, and he wasn't shy about broadcasting them. When it came to Moore's declining pace in the early 70s, Clough said what a lot of people were quietly thinking but nobody wanted to say about a World Cup winning captain. That Moore was slowing down, that his positioning could no longer fully compensate for the yards he was losing, that the game was catching up to him. Here's what made it brutal: timing. Television replay technology was becoming a real fixture of match broadcasts around this exact period. For the first time, viewers at home could watch a moment back in slow motion, freeze it, dissect it. Every hesitation, every step Moore was a fraction slower on, got played back and analyzed in a way that simply hadn't existed for defenders a decade earlier. Clough didn't need to exaggerate. He just needed to point at the replay and say what everyone could now see for themselves. And this hit at the worst possible moment, during England's qualifying campaign for the 1974 World Cup. The campaign that, infamously, England failed to get through, missing out on the tournament entirely. Moore, still a fixture in the squad, became an easy symbol for critics looking to explain the decline. Not because he alone was responsible for the failure, international qualifying campaign's collapse for a dozen structural reasons, but because he was the biggest name attached to it, and biggest names make the easiest targets. Let me be fair for a second. Clough wasn't lying. That's what makes this particular pressure point different from the others on this list. Greenwood and Ramsey were making calculated institutional decisions. The FA was being systemically negligent. But Clough was, in a fairly literal sense, just telling the truth on television. Moore's pace genuinely was declining, and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest punditry. But truth and cruelty aren't mutually exclusive. Clough delivered his assessments with the kind of blunt, borderline gleeful public bluntness that turned an honest football observation into something closer to a public dismantling of the nation's greatest captain, broadcast into living rooms across the country. The cumulative effect was a shift in public perception that Moore had never really had to deal with before. For over a decade, he'd been untouchable in the court of public opinion, the calm hero of 1966. Now, for the first time, a significant chunk of the football-watching public was starting to see him as a liability. Not because of one bad game, because of a slow, television-amplified drip of doubt, repeated often enough to calcify into consensus. And once public opinion turns, selectors and managers start listening to it, whether they admit it or not. If Moore represented one philosophy of English defending, cerebral, positional, elegant, win the ball before the opponent even knows it's a contest, Norman Hunter represented the polar opposite. Hunter's entire reputation was built on physical aggression. Hard tackling, no hesitation, the kind of defending that intimidated forwards before the whistle even blew. English football nicknamed him Bite Your Legs Hunter, and that nickname alone tells you everything about the contrast between these two players. In a pivotal qualifier against Poland in 1973, part of that same doomed campaign Clough had been picking apart on television. Hunter got the nod ahead of Moore. It wasn't framed loudly as a changing of the guard at the time, but that's functionally what it was. England's manager was signaling, even if only for one match, that raw physicality might be a better answer to the moment than Moore's fading positional mastery. And here's the twist that makes this whole chapter sting even more. It didn't work. England didn't win that qualifier. The physical alternative to Moore didn't save the campaign or fix what was actually broken about that England side. Moore got shelved for the raw, aggressive alternative, and it changed nothing about the outcome. None of this is to say Hunter didn't deserve his opportunity. He was a genuinely excellent defender in his own right, with a long, respected career and an England cap tally that speaks for itself. This isn't about tearing Hunter down to build Moore back up. It's about recognizing that the decision to swap one style for another mid-crisis rarely comes from careful long-term planning. More often, it comes from panic dressed up as a tactical adjustment, and Moore happened to be the one standing closest to the door when that panic hit. That's the real gut punch buried in this chapter. Bobby Moore wasn't pushed aside because something better replaced him and delivered results. He was pushed aside because English football, in a moment of panic, decided elegance was the problem, and physicality turned out to be no solution at all. And it's worth sitting with how familiar that pattern feels even now. Every few years, English football convinces itself that some new style, some new archetype is the missing ingredient, only to swap it in, watch it fail to fix the underlying issue, and quietly move on without ever really reckoning with the decision. But here's the twist that flips this entire chapter on its head. Norman Hunter, the man who literally replaced Bobby Moore on the pitch, the physical opposite of everything Moore represented, spent the years after his own career speaking about Moore with something close to reverence. In interviews given long after they'd both retired, Hunter didn't frame Moore as a rival he'd overtaken. He talked about him the way you talk about the best player you'd ever shared a pitch with, someone whose reading of the game he considered unmatched, calling him the greatest defender he personally ever saw play. Sit with that for a second. The man English football turned to as Moore's physical replacement ended up becoming one of his loudest defenders in retrospect. Not because he had to, because, once the pressure of the moment was gone, the truth was obvious to him. There was no real rivalry. There was a system that briefly got it wrong, and a player who deserved better than he got. So here's where we land after 5 names, 5 sources of real and sustained pressure across an entire career. Ron Greenwood, the mentor who sold him short. Alf Ramsey, the manager who dropped him the moment discipline was tested. The Football Association, who handed him silence instead of a seat at the table. Brian Clough, who turned his decline into a television spectacle. And Norman Hunter, the physical alternative who literally took his shirt in a must-win qualifier. 5 people. 5 real, documented sources of friction across Bobby Moore's career. And not one of them, when you actually lay the facts out in order like this, adds up to hatred. That's the twist this whole video has been building toward. The thumbnail says, hated. The reality is a lot less dramatic and a lot more honest. This was pressure. Institutional, professional, generational pressure. A captain caught between an outdated contract system, a manager whose loyalty had strict conditions, a federation that didn't know how to honor its own legends, a media landscape discovering slow-motion replay at the worst possible time for an aging defender, and a changing philosophy of English football that briefly, mistakenly decided brute force was the answer. That's the real story behind 5 rivals who hated Bobby Moore. It's not a story about hatred at all. It's a story about how easily genuine, complicated professional pressure gets flattened into a simple, punchy narrative once enough time has passed, and how the people closest to it, when they finally speak honestly, almost always walk it back. Because when you strip away the friction, the transfer disputes, the dropped call-ups, the TV criticism, the shirt he lost to a harder tackling rival, what's actually left is this. 544 appearances for West Ham United. 108 caps for England. Captain of the only England side in history to lift the World Cup. A defending performance against Brazil in 1970 that's still shown in coaching sessions 50-plus years later as close to perfect. Institutions can undervalue you. Managers can drop you the moment it's convenient. Federations can forget you the second you stop being useful to them. Critics can turn your decline into content. Rivals can take your place on the pitch. And none of it actually erases what you built while you were there. Bobby Moore was never hated by the people on this list. He was pressured by them, sidelined by them, criticized by them, and eventually replaced by them. But every single one of them, in the end, either needed him, envied what he had, or came around to admitting what he was. The best English defender most of them ever saw. And maybe that's the real lesson buried under the clickbait framing. The people who make you feel smallest in the moment, the club that undersells you, the manager who drops you, the federation that forgets you, the critic who picks you apart on camera, the rival who takes your shirt, aren't always your enemies. Sometimes they're just the mechanism through which pressure gets applied to anyone who reaches the top of a system that was never built to be kind to the people running it. Moore absorbed all of it, kept his composure in public the entire time, and let history sort out who was right. History sorted it out. Walk into any conversation about the greatest defenders England has ever produced and Moore's name is still the first one out of most people's mouths. Ahead of players with faster legs, flashier stats, louder personalities. Not because the mythmakers protected him. Because what he actually did on the pitch across an entire career of pressure from every direction still holds up when you strip every bit of sentimentality away and just watch the tape. Every one of the 5 names on this list, in their own way, ended up proving Moore's case for him. Greenwood's club couldn't function at its highest level once he was gone. Ramsey never found another captain who read the game the way Moore did. The FA spent decades being quietly compared to federations that treated their legends better. Clough's own criticism, in hindsight, reads less like an attack and more like a snapshot of a defender bowing out on his own terms rather than being carried off. And Hunter, the one man who physically took his place, became, of all people, the loudest voice insisting Moore was untouchable. So, 5 rivals or 5 pressures. I've made my case. Now it's your turn. Drop your take in the comments. Who do you think came out looking worse in this story, Greenwood or the FA? I read every one. A like genuinely helps more than you'd think. And subscribe if you want more of these World Cup legacy deep dives as the tournament rolls on. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time.